This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a fantastic organisation. It is remaining very busy throughout this global pandemic period. ASA puts out a regular newsletter in which it updates its members about publications, books, profiles, members of the organisation, calls for papers, upcoming events, funding opportunities. So it's a really great newsletter. The last one came out just a couple of days ago. So if you're not a member of ASA, that's just one of the many things you're missing out on. Membership is very affordable. It's only 15 Australian dollars for unwaged people, and you can join from anywhere around the world. So think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This episode is also brought to you by the wonderful people at Animal Publics. Have you been to Animal Publics and had a look at the books on offer? Animal Publics is part of the University of Sydney Press. It's a particular part of that press where they have animal studies focused books. The series is curated by Melissa Boyd and Fiona Probyn-Rapsey. They do an absolutely fantastic job. They are very particular and selective in the books they include in the series, all of a very, very high quality. So check out Animal Publics at the University of Sydney. Okay, let's get down to business. So this is another episode of Knowing Animals being recorded during the coronavirus 19 global pandemic. I'm at home in my apartment in Annandale in Sydney, Australia. It's a very, very grey day here in Sydney. It's raining and grey, but I'm happy to be indoors and to be safe and to be sitting with a little heated blanket, so I'm feeling rather snug. And I'm really lucky to be joined by somebody who's coming to who's joining me and joining you from the other side of the planet. This is another episode that is made possible by this move to online recording. So this week I'm joined by Connor K. Kianpour, and Connor knows that I can't talk properly. How did I go with your pronunciation there, Connor?
It was all right. My last name is pronounced Kianpour, but it was great.
Kianpour.
Yes.
Okay, so I didn't do very well, but you're very generous anyway to pretend that I didn't completely mess that up. Now, Connor is a political philosophy student at Georgia State University, and we're going to discuss Connor's article, Cetacean Property, even the whole. Can you just say the name? The name of your paper is as befuddling to me as your surname. Could you tell us what your paper's called?
Cetacean Property, a Hegelish account of non-human property.
Okay, and the Hegelish is a word that you, I think, perhaps have developed, so you'll be able to tell us more about what that means in a moment. And this paper is going to appear very soon in the journal Politics and Animals. So welcome to the podcast, Connor.
Thank you so much for having me, Siobhan.
It's my great pleasure. And now we can move past the bit where I've got no idea what's going on, and we can turn to someone who does very much know what's going on. So, Connor, what inspired this work?
So this article began as an undergraduate thesis that I wrote under the direction of Roberta Milstein at the University of California, Davis, while I was an undergrad there. And the reason I ended up getting into writing about dolphins and property rights was kind of twofold. So first, what got me interested in philosophy in the first place were the discussions taking place in political philosophy, so like distributive justice, state legitimacy, the foundations of rights, stuff like that. So I knew I wanted to spend my senior year of college researching and writing about something that was intelligibly political philosophy. So that was one reason. And then the second was that the philosophy professor who I developed the strongest relationship with at Davis ended up not being a political philosopher. Most of her work was in the philosophy of the biological sciences, the philosophy of ecology, and environmental ethics. And so basically, if I wanted to work with her, but still write about something that interested me, I'd have to get kind of creative. And at the time, I'd finished reading Jeremy Waldron's Right to Private Property and was particularly taken by the Hegelian line and thought it might be interesting to see if I could defend the claim that certain higher order animals have rights to private property. Roberta, my advisor, was enthusiastic about the project and its novelty and basically encouraged me to pursue it, so I did. And I chose dolphins specifically to focus on because I love them, think they're absolutely brilliant, and happened across Thomas I. White's In Defense of Dolphins around the same time that I started working on the thesis.
Wonderful, fantastic. So you're clearly a very capable emerging animal studies scholar. And you're also being very creative, which I think is perhaps a common experience among people who pursue, animal-focused research within the academy. So getting now into kind of the nuts and bolts of the paper or the weeds of the paper, whenever I see Hegel, I think, oh, this is going to be complicated. Can you tell us who this person is and what this person had to say about property?
Sure. So, like my befuddling title suggests, I am not really concerned necessarily with what Hegel himself had to say about property, but with contemporaries who have interpreted Hegel. I'm interested in seeing what they had to say about how they thought property rights should be conceived of if we were to look to Hegel to conceive of them. So the three people that I am interested in my piece, Margaret Jane Radin is one of them, and she distinguishes between two kinds of property in her works dealing with property. And she talks about fungible properties, which are properties that could be replaced with goods of equal market value. And then personal properties, which are properties that are really, really intimate and that cannot be replaced by objects of equal market value because there isn't really a way to put a market value on a personal property. So like for her, the paradigmatic example would be like the home. And so she's one of the three Hegelish property rights theorists that I kind of focus on. The second of the three is Mirdan Cohen, and he kind of makes an argument that's similar to Radin in the sense that he thinks that property kind of gets its legitimacy from the fact that it allows us to express our identity, and it's integrated into the boundaries of the self, as he says. And then the third kind of Hegelian property rights theorist that I consult in my paper is Jeremy Waldron. And he kind of takes a similar line where he says that the reason that property is legitimate is because it allows us to develop agency, it helps us develop a stronger sense of identity, and it allows us to become self-determining individuals, essentially. So I kind of look to these three interpreters of Hegel rather than Hegel himself and try to figure out what it means for a property rights theoretic to be broadly Hegelian, or as I term it, Hegelish. And yeah, so if that gives you a better idea of what that means when I talk about it.
Yes, wonderful. So it's not just Hegel, it's Hegel being reimagined by a series of contemporary theorists. But Locke, yes. Good old Locke also makes an appearance. Who is this Locke character and what does he have to say about property?
So John Locke So I would say that John Locke and a Hegelish or a Hegelian property rights theoretic are not necessarily at odds with each other. They both are similar in the sense that Hegelish theoreticians they suggest that you have to labor on objects in order to confer a property right in them. And so does Locke. Locke is all about labor mixing and doing things to objects that alter them and create greater value in the object so that the object becomes the property of the individual who labors upon it. And I think that somebody who's broadly Hegelian could also say that that is what makes property legitimate, but also that for Locke, he leaves it at labor mixing being the thing that makes property the property that makes property important to the individual who owns it. Whereas a Hegelian would also say that not only does laboring upon an object make the property valuable, but the things that the object does for the individual who labors upon it, namely the ways that the object allows you to develop your identity or allows you to become a self-determining agent and allows you to understand your role within a broader social context. These are all important aspects of what makes property so important to Hegel, whereas Locke, he's just kind of more concerned with, as long as you're laboring upon an object, you can legitimately claim the object as your own. Whereas with Hegel, you could claim the object as your own, but then there's a sense in which the property right strengthens in proportion to the extent to which the property allows you to develop your identity and agency and your role within a particular social context.
So Locke, however, is a great source of irritation for me. I'd love to have a good long talk with this Locke character because he very explicitly claimed that the grass his horse have chewed is his. So he didn't actually allow for animals to labour and therefore he didn't allow animals to labour in a way that converted the public good into the private property. Does that matter for you?
So I don't know, and I know that that's a common talking point, I think, especially with people that are interested in extending property rights to non-human animals. I don't know if that necessarily bothers me so much because there are a lot of brilliant thinkers who give us frameworks that are worthy of implementation in many ways. Like, I personally do like Kant, no matter how problematic he is if you read him by the book and refuse to. If you're like an orthodox Kantian, there are problems that you run into. But there are a lot of really valuable insights that are generated by Kant. And so I think the same could be said for Locke in the sense that even though he's kind of working within this very, very narrowly anthropocentric worldview, that it could nonetheless be expanded to include non-human animals. And we could just say that Locke was wrong about animals not being able to own private property and just expand the rest of the theory to include them. Whether we should on their own merits, like, I don't know. That's the more interesting conversation to me.
So, what are the Dolphins up to then that leads you to look to these theories?
So, for me, I guess, so I am really interested in protecting non-human animals considerably in ways that they are not currently protected. I do think, however, when it comes to certain kinds of liberal concepts, and property rights in particular seem to be the type of concept that liberal theorists have good reason to be persnickety about and to not want to allow for like anyone to just be able to say that they could have a legitimate claim in anything. Like there's a way in which property does matter, but we want to be able to be particular about what the limitations are for property. Like it wouldn't make sense for somebody to have a monopoly of all natural resources in a particular country. And we would want to have our property rights system in place acknowledge the limits of property. And so it might be the case that certain animals shouldn't have property, not because they don't deserve to have their interests protected in other ways, but that property might be the type of concept that is applicable only to certain types of individuals. And the strict protections associated with property might benefit individuals that have certain types of capacities in a way that requires that they have their right respected more than individuals who lack those capacities. And so dolphins are an interesting case in the sense that they're non-humans, but they seem to have these unbelievable cognitive capacities that would lead us to believe that they have interests that are very much like our own. And when I say very much like our own, we were to take like a normal distribution of the interests of human beings, that probably the interests that dolphins have would be very similar to the normal distribution curve of the interests that humans have. And so if it's the case that humans have property rights for reasons that deal with agency, identity, and understanding oneself within a social context. And dolphins have the capacities that undergird those interests that humans have in property as well. I say that we would be mistaken to not extend all those property protections associated with human beings to dolphins and their habitats.
So can you give listeners an example of the kind of thing dolphins are up to that makes you view them in that particular way?
So Thomas I. White's In Defense of Dolphins is kind of the book that really made me realize how remarkable dolphins are. And he talks a lot about, first, just like the basics, like the mirror self-recognition test, the dolphins pass with flying colors. So like if you were to rub zinc oxide on a dolphin's skin and then put a mirror in front of them, they would start nudging their head in the direction that the zinc oxide was in to try to get it off of them, So they recognize themselves and have self-concept. Then another characteristic that dolphins have that's interesting is they refer to one another with these things called signature whistles. So every dolphin kind of has like a frequency that is associated with them in the same way that we have names to call each other as humans. And so not only do dolphins have like this rich notion of self-concept, but they also have a concept of other minds. And so those are like two examples of some things that might give us reason to believe that there's something more going on with dolphins that may not be with like all non-human animals, but also dolphins have proven to be exceptional at problem solving. Like there was one study where somebody created like a kind of lockbox that had food inside of it and tossed it into waters that dolphins were inhabiting, and the dolphins were able to like crack the code on the lockbox in a way that was collaborative. So they kind of like communicated with each other to try to solve this problem in a way that was much more sophisticated than I suppose humans are used to seeing animals solve problems, if we would even say that others solve problems in any way that's comparable.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So then, Connor, what would property rights do for the dolphins? What kind of advantage would it, extend?
Right. So this kind of brings me to the conversation that I place myself in with other people that have done stuff on non-human property rights recently. So John Hadley, for example, and Steve Cook and Josh Milburn. So John Hadley and Steve Cook, they kind of have interest-based accounts of non-human property. And so essentially what grounds the interests that animals have in, what grounds the property rights that animals confer in their habitats, according to them. And obviously there are differences between their views, and they're a lot more complex and rich, but just as like a sketch, what grounds the rights that those animals have in their habitats is the strong interest that those animals have in the habitats for the purpose of existence and for the purpose of advancing their well-being, essentially. So then the thing about their view is that it is very much concerned with use. So as long as animals get to use the things in which they have these strong interests in, their property is being respected. But I suggest that one of the benefits from the perspective of somebody who's an animal rights activist, for suggesting that dolphins not only have like these interest-based property rights in their habitats, but these Hegelian or Hegelish property rights in their habitats, is the fact that use is not the only incident that matters for a Hegelian property rights theoretician. So they also believe in like the importance of an animal being able to, or a human or animal being able to destroy their property or be able to transfer their property. And not only do the animals have a right to the use of their property, but they have rights against humans using their property. So you get a much stronger means by which to afford legal protections to dolphins if we were to go down the Hegelian route as opposed to an interest-based account route.
I see. Does it matter for you as a theorist, or for the dolphins in practice perhaps, that they, at least part of the time, live in places where we don't normally ascribe too many private property rights?
Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it just strikes me that they live in the ocean, and normally we think of, national territory as ending at a particular point, and then we move into more common property. So we don't normally think of anyone in particular owning, so for instance, I think John Hadley's work deals primarily with animals that might live in a forest that we'd otherwise think is owned by a particular individual, and we don't normally think of the waters or all waters in that way.
Yeah, so I think that that's exactly correct, that we don't think of all waters in that way. I think that we're mistaken for not thinking about them in that way, especially if we have rights holders that have a legitimate claim to those waters in ways that perhaps we can't conceive of because we're humans and we have legs. But yeah, I think you're correct. But at the same time, I feel as though, even though it's the case that we don't normally take those things to be eligible for property ownership, that doesn't preclude the idea that they are eligible for property ownership to those who have strong interests in them.
Okay. And perhaps it could even be an advantage to the extent that at the moment there is no pre-existing private property or exclusive property rights in at least some waterways. So perhaps that's one obstacle that's removed, theoretically and also in practice. Well, look, that's all extremely interesting. I'm sure the dolphins are very pleased to hear that they've got their, that this work's going on. So, Connor, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
As ready as I'll ever be.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, so I want to say that the first time I read actual animal scholarship was Tom Reagan's The Case for Animal Rights, like his essay, not his book. But the first time I remember being introduced to pro-animal ideas in an academic context was oddly enough in high school when one of my teachers vocalized her disdain for zoos on animal welfareist grounds. And I think that's when my love for animals started becoming more of a rational type of enterprise that was focused on advocacy for them.
Yeah. Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Embarrassingly enough, the piece we discussed today was my first piece of pro-animal scholarship.
No need to be embarrassed. If you're publishing while you're still doing your PhD, you're doing very, very well.
I'm actually just in a master's program right now.
Well, then you're doing even better. I'm expecting big things from you, Connor.
Thank you.
People will come back to this interview and say, "Oh, this was the first interview he did." If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So, okay, this is really difficult.
I know.
How many have been influencing the way that I think about non-human animals, especially recently, and you included, of course.
Of course.
But I would have to say probably that Josh Milburn's work is what has really, really gotten me to care about writing pro-animal scholarship. So I'm a bit of an odd animal studies scholar because I have classical libertarian leanings, I guess. And I'm a bit of an odd libertarian because I believe animals have rights. Josh has written about Nozick in animals, Lockean labor mixing in animals, and his work showed me that I could write from my own perspective as an animal studies scholar. So I would go with him.
Wonderful. Well, another vote there for Josh.
Yeah.
Good on you, Josh. So, Connor, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Obviously, I am a lowly graduate student, so I likely know very little about what I'm saying or talking about. But one thing I've noticed is that more time is spent having conversations that we can afford to have once we've already bought into the idea that animals are creatures with dignity that deserve affection and protection. And in doing so, I think sometimes it's easy to forget that a supermajority of the world hasn't bought into that idea yet. And we should be spending a lot more time developing arguments that get people to buy into the claim that animals are worthy. So I guess like animal scholars should be weary of developing an echo chamber outside of which they lose sight of the larger battles that need to be fought. And also, I think animal scholars shouldn't be purists to the extent that they completely eschew anthropocentric arguments that move us toward better treatment for animals. I guess that's more than one thing, but kind of that family.
No, that's very interesting. It's very interesting to hear that perspective. I think some people have been thinking that we don't need to worry about first principles anymore because everyone knows and agrees. But so it's really interesting to hear that perspective, and maybe that's something we need to revisit.
Yeah.
So, Connor, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
So when you sent me these questions, this is the one that I've been struggling with the most. Because I don't know if there is one thing that could change to improve relations in a meaningful way. But I guess the fact that most human beings make the lazy connection between human superiority and domination, I guess, like the fact that just because human beings or most human beings are superior to non-human animals in certain respects, I don't see how that particular argument moves us to accept that dominating animals in the way that we do is acceptable or permissible. So I guess the way, like, what I would change would be the conception that humans have of superiority when it comes to animals, and realizing that if we said that superiority in a certain respect were enough to kind of create these horrendous relationships with other individuals, that we would see that superiority isn't enough to make that argument. I mean, there are lots of animal studies scholars that have accepted that human beings are superior to non-human animals in certain ways. Like Bridget Brophy, the reason that she believes that animals should be protected is because human beings are superior in ways that allow us to offer them those protections. So I guess that would be the thing that I would change.
Great. Well, Connor, what are you working on next?
So I've got a lot of exciting stuff coming up, at least exciting for me. I don't know. I'm working on a piece that's dedicated to spelling out the implications of the liberal commitment to anti-cruelty as it applies to animals, and a piece talking about religious exemptions from otherwise generally applicable anti-cruelty statutes. And I just recently started sketching out the contours of a piece that would try to develop an animal ethic by drawing on conservative values. So we'll see how those go. And then non-animal related, I'm doing stuff in bioethics that might interest people. Yeah.
Right. Wonderful. And so, Connor, do you see a PhD in your future? Is that the next move?
Yeah, so I'm going to be applying out in the fall, and given how hard departments are being hit because of COVID right now, I'm increasingly being filled with more anxiety about embarking on this journey. But I think I'm just going to give it my all and see what happens. But yes, I'm planning on applying to PhDs soon.
Wonderful. And will it be an animal-related study, do you think?
So I definitely want to be able to keep my interests in animal ethics and the political turn in animal ethics with me. But I think primarily I'm going to be trying to apply to programs that are strong in political philosophy and try to bring an animal studies perspective to whatever program I end up at.
Wonderful. Well, how can people find out more about your work?
Funny you should ask. I have a personal website. My name, yes. ConnorKianpour.com. That's updated frequently. I have links to all my work up there, my CV, some ways you can contact me if you're interested in my work. And I also blog there, sometimes about animals. So that's where you could find me.
Wonderful. Well, Connor, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a wonderful experience.
My pleasure. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. And you can also find us online. We're at Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can follow me at SO_S. We're also at Facebook and Instagram. Finally, don't forget to leave a review. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast and learn all about the animal issues we discuss here. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.